The new Shimmering Skies starter decks were recently revealed, and we are so excited to share them with you.
We've studied them, played around, taken a look at some combos, and we have to say, these are some of the best starter decks that they've produced, and we can't wait to talk about how you should play them and key combos and cards.
So today we're going to look at the new Ruby Amethyst starter deck, Let Loose.
Let's go!
Yay! This deck is packed with new cards because we get to see 31 brand new Shimmering Skies cards and no cards from previous sets, which is kind of a new thing going on. There are tons of new characters, one location, sadly no songs, but great actions to make up for it, and 2 new items.
We would describe this as an aggressive mid-range deck with a nice bell curve to it. 36 of the cards cost 3 and below and 24 4 and above. We'll talk about overall lines of play and strategy in a moment, but first let's take a look at each of the cards in this deck and how you should use them turn by turn, starting with turn 1.
First up is 3 copies of Simba, Adventurous Successor. He is an uninkable 2/1 with 1 lore. And while he's an okay first turn play because he is uninkable and he has 2 strength, you could also look at maybe saving him for a little bit later, as he allows you to add 2 strength to another character when you play him.
Next up is 3 copies of Taffeta Mutton Fudge, crowd favorite. Now, she is a 1/2 with 1 lore, so not great stats for a turn 1 play. And her ability isn't going to be terribly useful early either. Her ability says, when she moves to a location once per turn, your opponents lose 1 lore. And obviously won't have a location until later in the game. But the one thing she does do for you is set up a turn 2 shift with one of your 3 Floodborn, Taffeta Mutton Fudge, Soul Speedster. Oh my goodness, this is a tongue twister. If you have the Floodborn in hand, consider her an ideal turn 1 play.
On turn 2 is where this deck's aggressive tendencies really start to shine. Starting off with 2 copies of Daisy Duck, Spotless Food Fighter. Daisy is a 2/2 with 1 lore and evasive, hence being spotless. Daisy is a great turn 2 play because you can quest with her safely, gaining lore unless your opponent has an answer for an evasive card.
Next up, you have 2 cards, Taffeta Mutton Fudge, Ruthless Rival, and Maleficent Vengeful Sorceress with 2 copies each. Now, these are both the same. They're vanilla 2/2s with 2 lore. It allows you to start pushing your lore total pretty early. And these cards are basically the same, except for Taffeta is a shift target, as we mentioned before.
And then we have 2 copies of Turbo, Royal Hack. Turbo is a 2/3 with 1 lore, and he has the ability that he can serve as King Candy for the purposes of shifting, which you can really ignore because there is no shift for King Candy in this deck. He also has Rush, appropriately, which makes him a decent challenger this early in the game with 3 willpower. And he's uninkable, so he's really a must-play.
On turn 3, your deck really opens up and you have a ton of options. Let's start with Anna, Eager Acolyte. Now, Anna is an uninkable 1/3 with 1 lore, so not great stats. When she comes into play, each opponent chooses and exerts one of their ready characters. Now, this is kind of a utility card for later in the game and not necessarily an ideal turn 3 play, but she also serves as a shift target for your 1 Floodborn Anna, which we'll talk about later. Next up is Minnie Mouse Dazzling Dancer with 2 copies. Now, Minnie Mouse is a 2/4 with 1 lore, and she has an ability that says, whenever you challenge with this character or a Mickey Mouse character, you gain 1 lore. Now, you do have a Mickey Mouse in this deck, and we'll talk about that combo later because it requires some setup. But the one thing I want to pay attention to right now is this 2/4 stat line. You have quite a few characters with this stat line on turn 3, and it's not a bad play. You have several cards like Simba and another action we'll talk about later, which can buff your character's strength, allowing you to make efficient trades. And 4 willpower is decent on turn 3 in these starter decks, allowing it to challenge into something and stay around the next turn, perhaps for another challenge. So something to pay attention to. Next up is 1 copy of Wreck-It Ralph Demolition Dude. Wreck-It Ralph is a 1/4 with 1 lore and has an ability that says when you ready this character, you gain 1 lore for each damage counter on him. Now, this is an interesting card, but it's definitely one your opponent can play around because you have no way to ready your characters in this deck, and you also have no way of putting damage counters on your own characters other than challenging into things. So I don't imagine this ability will go off too often, but it's a fun card to try to make use of. I don't know. It's kind of, I don't know.
And then we have 2 copies of Donald Duck, Daisy's Date. He's another 2/4 with 1 lore, and whenever he challenges another character, each opponent will lose 1 lore.
Next up is Snowana Rainbow, Cool Competitor with 2 copies. It's another Sugar Rush racer, and this one is a 2/4 with 1 lore and Rush. Now, this racer is uninkable, so you may as well play it on turn 3 and get some value out of it in the early game if the opportunity is available, rather than it sitting in your hand for the long term. Definitely a card I would consider playing on turn 3 if it's available.
And then we have 2 copies of Gale Wind Spirit. Gale is a 1/2 with 1 lore, and its ability says whenever it's banished in a challenge, you can return it to your hand. That allows you to play it over and over again. I really loved this card, and when we were testing these decks, it did a lot of work for me.
Next up is your only location in this deck, Library, a gift for Belle with 2 copies. Now I really wish you had more copies of this because this card does work in this starter deck. This is an 8 willpower location with a 1 movement cost and 1 lore, but it has an ability that says whenever a character is banished while here, you may draw a card. Now a couple notes on this. It doesn't say during your turn, and it also doesn't say banished in a challenge. So anytime a character is here and they're banished, you get to draw a card. Now although you can play this card on turn 3, we definitely recommend waiting until at least turn 4. You could also move a character there immediately, challenge with it, have it banished in a challenge, and then draw a card off of it. So it's a card that gives you a ton of utility. And in our test games, Aaron would usually get 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 cards off of this location before it's removed. 8 willpower is just a lot to deal with many starter decks, and it forces your opponent to choose between characters and locations. And let's not forget that you do have a couple characters in this deck that synergize with locations, including the 1 cost Taffeta, which reduces your opponent's lore by 1 when she moves to location, and the Floodborn Taffeta, which gives you 2 lore when she moves to a location. So overall, this is a fantastic card. I would keep it in any hand, and I love it so much.
I also loved playing the library with Gale because I was able to move Gale to the library, quest with it. My opponent, Liam, would challenge and banish Gale. It would come back to my hand. I'd draw a card, and I just keep doing this process over and over and over again. And I made myself a little card draw engine. It was great.
On to turn 4.
Starting at turn 4 are 2 copies of King of Hearts, Monarch of Wonderland. He's a 1/4 with 2 lore, and he has an ability that says that you can exert him and prevent your opponent's chosen character from readying at the start of their next turn, if they're exerted already.
Look, we're just going to go with that because we've had like 8 takes of this card, so that's what you're getting in this video. On to the next card. Next up is 2 copies of Earth Giant Living Mountain. Earth Giant is a 4/5 with 2 lore, a decently statted character for turn 4, but there's a drawback. When you play him, each opponent gets to draw a card. Now, even though your opponent gets a card, it's not a bad play for turn 4 depending on the game state because it's difficult for your opponent to deal with at that point in the game, and it quests for 2 lore. But play it carefully and consider inking it if that card would give your opponent an advantage in that moment.
And for this deck's first Floodborn, we have 2 copies of Taffeta Mutton Fudge, Sour Speedster. Taffeta is a 3/3 with 1 lore and shift 2. She has an ability that allows you to gain 2 lore when you move her to a location once per turn. Taffeta has 5 shift targets in this deck, so you're likely able to shift her if you want to play her efficiently.
Next up is 2 copies of Bruni Fire Salamander. Now, this is a great card. It's a 2/2 with 2 lore and evasive, another difficult card for your opponent to deal with. And even better, when this card is banished, it replaces itself, you get to draw a card.
I kind of feel like Pascal now has a friend.
Yeah, Pascal and Bruni.
And then we have 2 copies of Rance's Fluggerbutter, Chocolate Charger. It's a 4/4 with 1 lore.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah.
Next up is 2 copies of Mickey Mouse Enthusiastic Dancer. Mickey Mouse is a 2/4 with 2 lore and has an ability that says if you have a character named Minnie Mouse in play, he gains +2 strength. We'll talk more about this combination later.
Then we have 1 copy of Vanellope von Schweet's Random Roster Racer.
That's a tongue twister.
Vanellope is an uninkable 3/3 with 2 lore and rush. When you play her, she will gain evasive until the start of your next turn, which is a great way to deal with those other pesky evasive cards. And she's got 2 lore to boot.
Now we're moving on to 5 cost cards. The first one being Elsa, the 5th Spirit with 1 copy. Elsa is a 2/5 with 1 lore, rush, and evasive. And when you play her, you can exert chosen opposing character. She's a great card to play to exert in a character that your opponent might be trying to protect and to challenge them immediately and banish them. This is another rush evasive card that can deal with pesky evasive characters on your opponent's side of the board. And with 5 willpower, she's likely to stick around for future challenges.
For our second of 3 Floodborns, you have 2 copies of Archimedes Electrified Owl. And while he's not the enchanted version, he is still really pretty. Archimedes is a 1/4 with 1 lore, evasive, and challenger 3. So he's a really strong challenger going into those pesky evasive characters and locations. And he shifts for 3 on your 2-cost Archimedes, so you can get him out a little bit earlier if you need to.
That's it for 5 cost characters, so we're going to move on to cost 6 characters, and we're going to start with, well, the only one, the Nock Mystical Spirit with 2 copies. The Nock is a 5/5 for 1 lore, so not the best statted character for a 6 cost, but he has a really interesting ability. When the Nock enters play, it allows you to move 2 damage counters from a chosen character to a chosen opposing character. And this is definitely worth talking about because this can swing board states. This deck doesn't have a lot of targeted removal actions. It does have 2 actions we'll talk about later, which can banish characters, but other than that, there's not a ton that allow you to move characters without challenging. This is a card that does allow you to do that by shifting damage counters somewhere where they'll have the most impact. One other thing to note on this card is it doesn't say that you have to move damage counters from your characters to opposing characters. If there are no damage counters available on your side of the board, you can move damage counters from an opposing character to a different opposing character, so something to keep in mind.
Then we have one copy of Anna Mystical Majesty. Anna is a 4/5 with 2 lore. She has an ability called Exceptional Power, which exerts all opposing characters when she enters play. Anna is an uninkable 7-cost character, so she runs the risk of kind of becoming a brick in your hand if you draw her early and you're unable to play her. However, she is a Floodborn and you can shift her for 4 if you have her target available. And skipping over 8, straight to 9,
we have our last character in this deck, Olaf Happy Passenger, with 1 copy. Olaf is a 6/6 with 3 lore, and he can allow you to close out games if you get him on the board, but with 9 he's very hard to play. Luckily, he has an ability that says that you can reduce his cost by 1 for each exerted character on your opponent's side of the board. Now, this is a fun card that can close out games, but it forces you to constantly do math if he's in your hand, watching your opponent's characters and seeing how many are exerted, and it's just interesting. It's also interesting if your opponent knows you have this card because they're watching their characters and your ink and all of that, so I don't know. It's a fun card, it's a wild card, you won't always get to play him, but if you do, you can win the game. Now let's talk about our 2 items.
First up is the inkable 1-cost Retro Sphere, which allows you to pay 2 to banish it and then return chosen character, item, or location cost 3 or less to the player's hand.
Now this is a fun little utility card that can do a few different things for you. First, it's some removal for your opponent's cards, 3 or less, but can also bounce things back to your hand. So perhaps there's a library with some damage on it that you want to save, or a character that's quested and you want to bring them back to your hand and play them again ready, or perhaps there's a card that you want to get an enter play ability off of, like Simba. Next up, you have 1 copy of the Sword Released, a 3-cost uninkable card. This card says that at the start of your turn, if you have the strongest character in play, each opponent loses 1 lore and you gain lore equal to the lore lost. So in a 2-player game, your opponent would lose 1 lore and you would gain 1 lore. Now, this card is a bit wonky in this deck because you don't have a ton of high strength cards, and many of the other starter decks you'll play against will out-strength you much of the time. But it is a card that if you have it in play can swing games late, especially if you manage to drop that Olaf or perhaps that Floodborn Anna. Unfortunately, it is uninkable, so you're going to have to play it eventually, whether you want to or not. It's not necessarily a great card for the early game, but if you do play it, it forces your opponent to constantly thinking about their strength in relation to yours, because if they slip up once, that's a 2 lore swing. So it's a fun card. I don't know. It's a fun card.
Yeah. Moving on to actions. First up is the 2-cost Hypnotic Strength. This card allows you to draw a card and then chosen character gains Challenger 2 this turn. Any card that replaces itself is good in my book, and it allows you to surprise your opponent with this little Challenger 2 kind of early in the game if you need to.
Next up is your only removal action in this deck. It is Glimmer versus Glimmer, which allows you to banish one of your glimmers in order to banish an opposing glimmer. I have to say that Erin and I played these decks a bunch, and she made use of this card quite a bit to banish some of my bigger characters with Simbas and cheap things. So this is a great card, and I wouldn't hesitate to keep it in your opening hand if you can afford the uninkable.
Super fun. For the final card in this deck is the 5-cost Finders Keepers, which allows you to draw 3 cards. Now, this is a little expensive for 3 cards in my book. I would much prefer Friends on the Other Side, but in this starter deck, it's pretty decent.
So what's the best way to play this deck? We think of this as an aggressive mid-range deck, and you want to be doing a few things in the first 5 or 6 turns. First, you generally want to be the one driving the lore totals. You have some cheaper cards with high lore and evasive characters which can avoid challenges, and so you want to be the one pushing the lore total and forcing your opponent to respond. The next thing you're doing is looking for efficient trades. As your opponent leaves their characters vulnerable, you have cards like Hypnotic Strength and Simba which can increase your character's strength to surprise your opponent with an efficient trade. So you're looking to surprise your opponent at some point with these strength modification tricks in order to make efficient use of your cards. The last thing you're trying to do is use cards that replace themselves or replace other cards to keep your hand going throughout the mid game to outlast your opponent. Cards like Hypnotic Strength, Library, Gale, Bruni. So let's talk about your lines through your first 4 turns. On turn 1, as we mentioned, you have 2 options. If you have him in your hand, Simba's probably your better play because he's uninkable and so you have to play him at some point anyway. And he has 2 strength and so he does more damage when he's challenged. If you don't have Simba, you can play Taffeta if you're setting up the shift line. It's perfectly okay not to play Taffeta if you have her and just not play something on turn 1 if you need the ink. But if you're setting up the shift, you'll want to get her on the board.
On turn 2, any of your 2 lore or evasive characters are great options. At this point in the game, you can look at driving your lore total this way.
On turn 3, any of your 2/4 characters are not a bad option. You can pair them with Hypnotic Strength or Simba to make an efficient trade if your opponent is responding to some of your early turn characters.
If you're not doing that on turn 4, playing the library and immediately moving a character is a great option, and it'll be difficult for your opponent to deal with. If you have control of the board, you could also look at using the Earth Giant because he's really hard to remove.
Bruni is also a fantastic turn 4 play as he has 2 lore, evasive, and you draw a card if he's banished, so what's not to like? And on turn 4, it's worth talking about the Mickey and Minnie combo. Now, because Minnie Mouse is cost 3 and Mickey Mouse cost 4, it's tempting to play Minnie Mouse on 3 and then Mickey on turn 4. However, you really reduce the element of surprise there. Much better to save Minnie Mouse, play Mickey on turn 4, and then play Minnie on turn 5 or later, allowing you to surprise your opponent with the 2 strength that Mickey Mouse gets from Minnie's presence.
Now let's talk about ink. In most games, you don't really need to ink past 6, sometimes even 5 with this deck.
When altering your hand, pay attention to 2 things. First off is your curve, making sure you have cards to play on each of your early turns, and then pay attention to certain combo pieces. For example, Floodborn Taffeta and her shift target, and Floodborn Archimedes and his shift target. These are both great shifts in the early to mid game. I wouldn't necessarily keep the 7 cost Anna though, like she's gonna be a brick oftentimes, and so you can definitely mulligan her away.
Other cards I'm keeping are the Uninkable Simba 1-drop, any low-cost evasives, and the library. Love having the library in my early hand.
I also really like Hypnotic Strength. It's a card that you can ink, you can use it to get a card, and you can do some weird board swings in the early game, and I kind of like it a lot.
So what do you think of the starter deck? Which one of the 2 new decks are you excited to try out? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.